All right. Hello, everyone. This is Justin McAfee. I'm your host today for Deep Green Resistance, where we're going to be covering an introduction to the book Deep Green Resistance. And I'm here with the authors, Lierre Keith and Derrick Jensen. Thank you all for joining me today. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I wanted to introduce this discussion just by talking from my own experience. It was just recently that I met Max Wilbert. I was out doing making a film about some Native Americans here in Nevada who were protesting a water pipeline where they wanted to suck water from eastern Nevada to Las Vegas. And Max made quite an impression on me. I asked him about some of the things he was talking about, and he recommended I read some of the works of Derrick Jensen and Lierre Keith. So I Googled your names, and I found this book, among others. And this book has really been very transformative for me, for my worldview, my perspectives on politics and the environment. I come from a background, working in electoral politics, organizing with nonprofit organizations, advocacy groups, trying to make a difference on the environment. And what I found from this book was, among other things, that the political system just isn't addressing these problems. So I wanted to start by asking, we can start with you, Lierre, and go to Derrick. But this book talks about working in the political system, or not working the political system, and how that is not wielding the changes that we need. So I thought I would start there and have you, address whether that's working in the system to save the planet is adequate.
Well, it's definitely not adequate. I also don't want to start off by telling people they're doing their work wrong, because honestly, we need everybody at every level doing the thing that they feel called to do. So I don't see my main focus being telling other people they're doing it wrong. I'd rather invite everybody in and say, whatever you're doing, it's the best you're doing, and that's great, because the world is in such bad shape that anything anybody can do is probably good. So I just want to start by saying that this is not in any way to, try to tear down people who are working so hard to try to do something inside the electoral system, because it's all we've got, right? I mean, somebody has to try. But having said that, it's necessary but not sufficient. Somebody has to do that, but we're going to need a whole lot more. And so the analysis has to be deeper. Whatever it is you decide to do with your life and where you're going to put your passion, that's great. As long as we all have that deeper analysis, I think it's, we can all still be on the same page.
Derrick?
I don't think it matters to the salmon why the dams on the Klamath come down, and whether they come down through a process involving many years of studying and bringing together alliances of various Indian nations and FERC and Pacific Power and states of California and Oregon, or whether they come down in an earthquake or whether somebody blows them up. I don't think it really matters to the salmon. And so I don't want to diss any of the wonderful work that people are doing, for example, to decommission dams around the world, and especially around this country, because it's happening a fair amount, and not fast enough though. And then there's a quick story back from in the 90s. I was working with these groups that were filing timber sale appeals to get the Forest Service to follow laws. They would put out a timber sale, and various people, myself included, as one very small part of it, would then read the environmental impact statements, read the environmental assessments, and find out the places the Forest Service was lying in order to put out a timber sale that they would pretend would have no significant impact. And by forcing them to follow the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the NEPA, NUFMA, Endangered Species Act, we were able to shut down their timber sale programs in several national forests because they were all illegal. And the response by the government was to people doing this around the country was to pass what they called the salvage rider, which basically said that the forests are in such a state of ecological collapse that we need to cut them all down. And so any forest that is necessary in order to do salvage or for forest health or whatever you want, whatever terms they wanted to put on it, will not be susceptible to any environmental regulations. And most of the forests that we'd saved during the previous 5 or 6 years were cut over the next 18 months. And one of the lessons from this is that anytime you use the rules of the system in order to stop the destructiveness of the system, they will figure out ways to change the rules. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't. One more story. I got a note from some young person after I wrote Endgame saying, hey, it's great that you went through that process of working within the system and getting screwed out on that because now I don't have to and I can skip straight to the next step. And I wrote back and said, no, you don't. We all have to go through it ourselves. I mean, you have to learn the lesson for yourself. And then one last thing. Sorry, I said the one last thing a minute ago. But when I used to teach at Pelican Bay State Prison, any idea I had of the revolution versus reform dichotomy fell apart because I have no patience for those who say, "Oh, that's doing work within the system is sellout work." Because if we all just wait for the great glorious revolution, there's not going to be anything left in the meantime. And likewise, if all we do is try to protect this or that piece of ground without stopping the destruction, the larger destruction, then there's going to be nothing left either. Anyway, working at Pelican Bay State Prison, I taught at a Supermax prison. And on one hand, I recognized I was part of the biggest racist gulag on the planet. And then on the other hand, a lot of my students said that my classes were helping keep them sane. And so I don't believe in the revolution versus reform dichotomy. I think that we need reform. I think we need revolution. I think we need it all. Which is a longer way of saying what you said.
Yeah, I see a lot of people discussing, voting and not voting, and especially with Bernie Sanders dropping out of the race. I see a lot of people online are talking about that, and some people saying they're not going to vote, and I've even asked myself the question if voting matters. But from what you're saying, would you recommend it's like vote, but just also recognize that that's not going to be enough? Like you can't just vote; you have to. The system itself is sort of fundamentally flawed, and we need to change that.
Yeah, I mean, you have this tiny little bit of power. It's tiny, but you might as well use it. It doesn't cost you anything to go vote. And I can never forget that people died in the cause of universal suffrage. Like, I think we would be insane not to at least do it. And if you have a mail-in ballot, it literally takes 30 seconds. So just do it. And know that, of course, it's tiny, but there's no reason not to just use your tiny if it's all you've got on that day.
Write in a third-party candidate. Do something with it. Use a voice to say, I can't stand any of you. Use it for something.
So I think also that, especially on a local level, voting can be really important. On a local level, I think it is possible to make a difference. In the local community here, there was actually we stopped a subdivision from going in by a vote of 3-2 at the county commissioner, board of supervisor level, and had that vote taken place a couple years later, it would have been 3-2 against us, and the subdivision would have gone in. So there are times when it can actually make a difference.
I think another area I've heard about, and I'm going to go off too far on this topic, but people who protest pipelines, for example, there have been some states that have passed legislation, and I think mostly Republicans support harder criminal violation or penalties for people who protest pipelines and things like that. So even just on that level, I guess voting could make a difference for people who are doing this work.
Yeah, and I mean, really, when you cast your vote for the presidential election, one of the things you're voting for is Ruth Bader Ginsburg's replacement. And I hate that we always have the Supreme Court held to it's like a loaded gun to our heads every single time. But that is the truth. So it's just another thing to weigh as November approaches.
So I've, read through this book, and, in the introduction, you talk about this is about fighting back. And I think you offer just a new way of looking at things that most people don't consider when they're looking at American politics and fighting back, really. Their idea of fighting back is, hey, let's get these people elected, or let's lobby, or let's go to a protest. But what is it, if you will, give us a bit of an overview of what this book, how it's different, and what it offers as a perspective on that.
And one of the things about the book is that it is proudly biocentric and ecocentric. It's environmentalism has really lost its way over the past 30 years, and gone from being about saving wild places and wild beings to perpetuating this culture. And this book, and really all of my work, is based on a couple things. One of them is the recognition that this way of life can't last, and when it's over, I would prefer that there is more of the world left rather than less. And it's also based on trying to look at this from the perspective of life on the planet, as opposed to the luxuries this way of life brings to the richest of us. And if you look at what's going on from the perspective of a blue whale, or polar bear, or phytoplankton, or a delta smelt, it changes everything. And it changes. One of the ways I talk about this quite often is, if space aliens came down from outer space and they were doing to the planet what the dominant culture is doing, what forms would our resistance take? They would take different forms. If space aliens were changing the climate, causing the greatest mass extinction in the history of the planet, bathing the world in endocrine disruptors, bathing the world in nerve agents, I don't think that books like Deep Green Resistance would be out there. Would be way out there. I think that they would be common currency. And so it's really about defending life on Earth. I mean, it's the most important thing to do, and it's the most important thing there is. So that's one of the things. Oh, and then one more thing, which is that before I wrote my book Endgame, when I used to do talks, I would ask people, do you believe that this culture will undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living? And out of the literally tens of thousands of people that I asked that question, nobody ever said yes. So the next question is, if you don't believe the culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living, and if you care about life on the planet, what does this mean for your strategy and for your tactics? And the answer is we don't know. And the reason we don't know is because we don't talk about it. And the reason we don't talk about it is because we're all so busy pretending that somehow there's going to be a miracle and things will turn out okay. And so all of my work, including this book, is really about cutting through all that. And it's like a doctor friend of mine says, that correct diagnosis is the first step toward proper treatment.
We wanted to actually suggest solutions that match the scale of the problem. And I don't feel to date that anybody else has done that. So they're not the happiest solutions, but I don't think it's impossible to save what's left of the planet. I think that life will come back if we stop destroying it. So I'm not out of hope at all, but nobody else is suggesting things that actually match, the size of what's like just the level of destruction day by day that's going on, and why that destruction is built into the system. That none of that ever gets discussed. So we wanted to discuss that, and then we wanted to actually propose solutions that would match that as a realistic resistance to the destruction. And I feel like everyone's just fallen down on the job. The environmental movement isn't doing that. The left isn't doing that as a whole. Like, just nobody seems to be doing that. So we attempted that.
I think you did a great job, because I think we look at politics. It's about, even the radical part of the left is Green New Deal, which is an industrial solution to environmental problems. It's based on economics. We have, I people in the Sierra Club, they talk about protecting public lands and clean air and things like that. They talk about all those things, but it's like the solutions are always these industrial, economic. It's in that framework. And what I really had my eyes open to is that, why aren't we questioning that fundamental thing about industrialism and the economics that are driving those things? So what would you add to this in describing the book in terms of how it addresses those things?
Well, they're solving for the wrong variable, because what they're trying to keep in place is industrial civilization, is this way of life. And this way of life is the problem. So you can't save the planet if you're trying to save this way of life. And also, even if you're still just trying to save this way of life, eventually you're going to kill the planet doing it. So it's a dead end no matter which way you go. And really the only option we have is to try to stop industrial civilization and save the planet, because that is the destruction. And the problem with this sort of current iteration of the environmental movement is that they're trying everything they can to simply power that destruction a little bit longer. So there's some realization that, all right, fossil fuel is kind of having a bad effect. Well, we'll just switch and we'll find some other way to power the destruction of the planet. And I just don't see how that's in any way a solution. Like, you're still destroying the planet. You're just going to do it with solar or wind instead. So I don't even know how everybody went off the rails so badly. It seems to me you have living communities, living creatures, and then you turn those into commodities, dead commodities, and then you turn those into private wealth. And that's the problem. And they're saying all of that is fine, we just need to power it a different way. And no, that is not actually fine. That is the problem. Like, why are you trying to save that?
So Robert J. Lifton wrote this amazing book called The Nazi Doctors. And in this book, he asked how it was that men, and they were men, who had taken the Hippocratic Oath could work in a Nazi death camp. And what he found was that, we'll leave Mengele aside, who was just a sadist and awful. What he found is that a lot of the doctors in the death camps would actually do whatever they could to help the Jews, and they would give them an extra scrap of food. They would hide them from the selection officers, or if they got typhus, they would kill them to keep other inmates from getting typhus, which is dreadful. And some of the doctors treated the inmates so well that after the war, at the minor Nuremberg trials, many of the inmates testified in defense of the doctors. And Lifton makes an absolutely brilliant point, which was many of these doctors were doing everything in their power to protect the inmates, except for the most important thing of all, which is they weren't questioning the existence of the death camp itself. And they weren't questioning working the inmates to death. They weren't questioning starving them to death. They weren't questioning poisoning them to death. But within the context of not questioning any of those assumptions, they were doing the best they could, which is frankly what a lot of environmentalists, myself included, do much of the time, is we try to protect this or that piece of ground, this or that creature, this or that place in without questioning the larger culture that is working the planet to death, starving the planet to death, poisoning the planet to death. And to go a different direction or to go with a different person, Robert Coombs wrote about how unquestioned assumptions are the real authorities of any culture. Excuse me. And so that's one of the things, that's one of the reasons I write, is I'm trying to at least make explicit a lot of these unquestioned assumptions, so then you can, I don't think we should take it as a given, as so many modern environmentalists do, that we need to save civilization. I think that we should have a discussion about, is saving this way of life more important than saving life on the only planet that we know of in the universe that has life? And I don't think, I mean, I like hot showers as much as the next person, but I don't think that they're worth killing the planet for.
I've heard this story about I think I've read it, or you've talked about it before, with the doctor from the doctors in the prison camps, and that was really effective for me. It really helped me to grasp this idea that even well-intentioned people fail to just question these underlying assumptions. Why don't we talk a little bit about green energy just for a second, because I know that is a crutch, I think, that is used. Would you be able to speak to why isn't green energy a solution? I mean, it obviously does something, but why isn't it? What's wrong with it?
Well, we just wrote a book about this, so that's going to be coming out in 9 months. So it's called Bright Green Lies. See a theme here. So a number of problems. Number one is, why do we want to continue to fuel the destruction of the planet? So from the get-go, you've got a solution that is just more of the same. This is not actually addressing the problem. It's just continuing the problem. So right away, it's like the basic reason this stuff exists. Why? Like that was everything that the environmental movement was supposed to be against, was destroying more land and destroying the birds and destroying the bats and the Scottish wildcats, and like, just name your creature. It's about to be destroyed by, quote, green energy. And we were supposed to be the people who cared about Silent Spring, and yet we're willing to sacrifice every last bird so that we can have wind energy. And why would we, and for what? So that we can, the only thing that requires this level of energy consumption is industrial civilization. That's all that it's for, so that we can have, aluminum cans and cold beer and, ice cream 24/7, or cars, like whatever. And sure, modern medicine, but I mean, both of us have very serious medical conditions. We might not be alive without modern medicine. So I'm happy to throw it all over. Like, what was it worth saving me? Killing the planet? Like, no, of course not. Like, nobody's single life is worth the rest of life on the planet. Like, there's no future in this. So, all right, that's one problem. Another problem is, in the whole of human history, adding more kinds of energy never reduces another form of energy. It's just added on. So adding on things like hydropower and wind power and solar power and the tidal and like whatever you want to add to it, it does not actually reduce the amount of fossil fuel that anybody's using. It just means more energy is available. And there's actually a word or phrase for that. It's Jevons paradox. So this guy figured this out 150 years ago, that, gosh, we make machines that use coal more efficiently. All that happens is people use more. Like, we don't ever use less, we just use more. And he's only been proven right. There's no exceptions to this. So it's not actually going to help. And we see this already. Yeah, they add a tiny bit of solar and a tiny bit of wind, which is honestly all you're ever going to get out of those technologies. But even pretending you could get a lot out of them, it's never going to reduce it. All it does is throw more into the grid. There's more available for industrial production. Everybody uses it. It never goes down.
Server farms, Bitcoin mining, indoor marijuana growing, those are fast growing consumers of electricity that didn't even exist 40 years ago. I always keep thinking of the Doobie Brothers album, "What Were Once Vices Are Now Habits." So what were once luxuries are now necessities. And I mean, Jevons paradox is everywhere. That energy efficiency in housing in the United States has increased by what, 50% since the 70s? It's increased significantly since the 70s, but has that meant reduced electrical use in houses? No, because the houses have gotten bigger such that they use the same amount of energy they did back then. And this is true.
The houses are big and half as many people live in them. So every time you give people the capacity to use more energy, we do it. Like, it never reduces the amount that we consume. It just increases across the globe. And we already know this. Like, this is not a new thing. That he knew this 150 years ago, and it's never not going to be true.
And there was recently a study of, I believe, 57 materials of somewhere in the 50s, whether Jevons paradox applied to them, that increased efficiency and usage. And it ended up that 54 of the 57 materials that were using more now than they did 40 years ago. And the ones they were using less of, it was not because of efficiency. One of them is asbestos. Another one was another one that has been found to be toxic. And the third one was wool because of substitution by polyester. So the point is that Jevons paradox applies all the way around. And you know, our work is based on this very simple idea that in order to stop murdering the planet, you do have to stop murdering the planet. Everything comes from somewhere.
I mean, yes. And we can also, we can go through those technologies one by one and say that, show and talk about how each one of them is actually just at least as destructive as fossil fuel. And that's also one of the lies that everybody seems very happy to kind of slide under so that they can keep promoting these things. But none of them are actually a substitute for fossil fuel. They all rely on that exact same infrastructure, all of which is utterly dependent on fossil fuel, especially diesel fuel. There's no way you're going to do things like, mountaintop removal and strip mining and rare earth mining without vast amounts of fossil fuel. It's ridiculous to think we're just going to do this, with some kind of substitution like solar and wind. It literally can't be done. It's not functionally replaceable. So they're living a fairy tale to think that they can replace it. But even if you could, all of those things that they're suggesting are at least as environmentally destructive. Some of them are slightly more destructive in different ways. They're not necessarily as bad for the climate, though some of them are worse, and we've been lied to. They are worse for the climate. So a lot of it's just out and out lies.
Hydroelectric.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is often they often say Costa Rica has gone carbon neutral on their electricity, and Bhutan and various other countries, but they are using dams and hydro as well as just killing rivers. Also, we've known for at least 20 years that dams produce more greenhouse gases per unit of electricity generated than do coal-fired plants, because they're called methane bombs. Dams are, because when you inundate the original forest, you kill it, and then things decay anaerobically at the bottom of the reservoir, and then that water is sent out into the world when it goes through the turbines. And that releases just huge amounts of methane, as well as, again, killing the river system. So that's just one example. And those are counted as carbon neutral, even though it's completely untrue. Biomass. People don't talk. People talk about this great miracle of renewables doing so much more. But the greatest increase in, quote, renewables has been biomass, which is simply cutting down forests and burning them. Or
we used to call that deforestation.
Yeah. Or another thing that it is clearing a field, planting corn, and then burning that. Those are all both called biomass. And biomass, when they cut down a forest and then burn it, that's considered carbon neutral, because in the next 100 years, the forest might grow back. And can you think of any accounting firm that would not go to jail if they said our books are balanced because we're putting out money right now and we hope to make it back in 100 years? I mean, that's Enron. There is, okay, so A, the technologies are destructive. B, they continue to promote this destructive way of life. C, they will never replace oil functionally. And D, the accounting on them is just bizarre and misleading. And E, they're all based on mining. And mining is perhaps the single most destructive. We can talk about agriculture. Mining is one of the most destructive activities humans have ever done. There are mines from ancient Rome that are still toxic. There is not a single hard rock mine in the world that does not pollute groundwater and surface water. They're incredibly destructive, and the plans that we hear pushed by Jacobson and Klein, it's Jacobson's plan that gets pushed by everybody else. They would call for increasing mining such that their plans would require 1.5 years worth of the world's supply of iron just for their windmills, solar panels, etc., and about 3/4 of a year, I think, worth of copper mining. It's like, I'm sorry, when did environmentalists actually promote mining? That has not been a traditional thing.
Well, again, it's a bizarre disconnect where this stuff does not grow on trees. You have to manufacture it somehow. And every step of the way, that you're going to be manufacturing this, it's the same industrial kind of horror scene that, for thousands of years, people have tried to stop. There's not a single mine that isn't, protested by the people who have to live there because it's so destructive. So, the fish die, the river turns orange and catches on fire, everybody ends up with pancreatic cancer, you can't live there anymore. And this is ongoing, but this has been true forever. I mean, the Greek and the Roman, the ancient mines they were penal colonies. And it was a death sentence because everybody knew you weren't going to live more than a few months in those conditions. Yeah. So, I mean, it was literally just, you were condemned to death. If that was the worst sentence you could get, was to go work in the mines. And Europe was covered in they still see the archaeological, when they do the samples, the core samples, you can still see the copper mining and all this, like all the way to Iceland. That's how much. Greenland, right? Greenland, the ice cores there. You can see the mines, and people would have been dying there from the poisons. So they have just universally been protested by people who were going to have to live in them. And all of a sudden, this is our great solution going forward: is more of this. And I'm just utterly baffled by what's happened to a movement that used to be my movement. Like, who are you people, and what have you done with environmentalism? I just don't get it. And for what? Just like, we were the people who were against all of this, and all of a sudden we're trying to promote it, and even more. Like, I'm just baffled by that's why we wrote a book, because I still don't really understand how. And the only thing that makes any sense is to say they're trying to solve it for the wrong variable. But why they want to continue this way of life when all along we were the people who were against it, that's what I don't get.
And I think, one of the focuses is often that it's fossil fuels that's causing climate change. But really, development is killing ecosystems. Consumerism is killing ecosystems. And all of these things are fueled by, even if it was green energy, it'd still be fueled by green energy, and that would still be doing the same thing. So I think that focus, just from my personal experience, I think I was focused on fossil fuels, climate change, not realizing that really the global destruction was happening in a variety of ways.
Well, that's exactly it. And again, for me, the big transformation, well, actually, it was never a transformation for me, but the
the thing that changes everything is to make your allegiance to the natural world absolute. And when you switch your allegiance away from protecting this way of life and toward protecting, I mean, there's an environmentalist who often has said to me that a lot of environmentalists begin by wanting to protect a specific piece of ground, and they end up questioning the foundations of Western civilization. And that's because they ask the question, well, first off, I don't want, like, I know this guy, Barry Rosenberg, who he started becoming an environmentalist back in the 70s because the Forest Service, he was a back to the lander, and the Forest Service clear cut the land right above his water supply and wrecked his water supply. Biggest mistake they made, because he has fought them for the last, I mean, back to the landers by themselves, they're not going to threaten the system. But now, because of that, he has spent the last 45 years fighting they should just, we won't cut his. Anyway, so he started with just that, and then, okay, I'm going to protect my land. And then you start asking, so why are they destroying the land? To make money. And then you start asking, well, why would you have an economic system where you destroy the land to make money? And then you start asking, have there been other ways of life that have not destroyed the land to make money? And then you start asking, where did this one start? How is it going to end? And as another environmentalist friend always says, if we keep going the way we're going to get to where we're going, which is not a particularly clean phrase, but it's very clear. And so if you start by wanting to protect, this piece of land, and then if you keep asking questions, this is where you end up. It's questioning the foundations of Western civilization. I don't know if we want to go here, but I also know a lot of women who started with trying to get their friend out of an abusive relationship and end up questioning the foundations of patriarchy. They start with one woman and goes from there. Same deal. Once you start asking the question.
Yeah, I started questioning a water pipeline here in Nevada, and I got connected with Native American people here who encouraged me to look at, what did my ancestors, how did they live? And I started, exploring that topic myself. I started questioning modern civilization, industrial civilization in general, and started trying to reconnect with my ancestors, Scottish, Irish.
Do you want us to talk about civilization, like our definition and why this is a problem? Because some people get very confused by that.
I think that would be good. Let's do that.
Okay. So civilization just etymologically, it just means people living in cities. Okay, but what that means is that they are living beyond what the land can supply. So they've used it all. So they're living in a density that requires the importation of resources. So the food, the water, energy all have to come from somewhere else. And from that point forward, that society is going to be dependent on imperialism and genocide, because no one willingly gives up their land, their water, their trees, their fish. But because that city has used up its own, it has to go out and get those from somewhere else. And that's the problem. So that's, world history over the last 10,000 years. Once you've started that process, it really doesn't matter what kind of beautiful, peaceful, spiritual values your culture might want to believe in. You are now dependent on imperialism and genocide. You're going to have to conquer your neighbors and take their stuff. And part of that conquering is going to require slavery, and it's going to require a military complex. You're going to end up with a hierarchical society, the king, and then the religious leaders, and then you're going to have the military strata, and then underneath that are going to be all the slaves who are doing the backbreaking labor, which is what agriculture is. So all of this is dependent on agriculture. That's what makes all of it possible, and it's what makes it inevitable, because agriculture is drawdown. It is an inherently destructive process. You will eventually run out of topsoil, and then you're really screwed. Then you really are going to have to go conquer your neighbors just to feed all the people living in those cities. So, for instance, in ancient Rome, a lot of the port cities of ancient Rome, if you interfered with the offloading of the grain that was being shipped in from, say, Egypt, it was summary execution. because it was so important to keep the cities fed. It was the only way to keep everybody pacified if they couldn't have food riots. And Egypt, all along the Nile there, was the personal possession of the emperor, because that's where the food was coming from. So they had it completely wrapped up, and they totally deforested Northern Africa in pursuit of all this. So eventually it collapses. There have been 34 civilizations. Every last one ends in collapse because it's drawdown and overshoot. You have a temporary advantage. If you're going up against your neighbors who aren't willing to destroy their forest, you will have that advantage because you're willing to destroy yours into a navy. Yeah, I mean, you've just used it all to make weapons of war. So now you can conquer them, and you have an entire class of people whose job is war and nothing else. So they're going to be really good at it, and they can dedicate themselves full time to it. They're not tied to the land somewhere where they have to get food for anybody. They're just off conquering. So they're always going to have that advantage, and they're going to get better and better at it, which is what happened in Rome. Yeah, I mean, just everywhere you look, they get better and better. They get better technology. They get better metal. Now they have all kinds of weapons that nobody's ever seen before, and that just keeps accelerating every year. We've got better weapons.
And this is anachronistic, right? This is just a bygone time.
Nope, it's now. The only difference now is that the whole thing's gone global. It used to be that civilizations at least were human scale, and there were a few reasons for that. Before fossil fuel, first of all, the supply lines could only get so long before they broke. So you could only get food to the soldiers a certain distance and then no further. So, for instance, the Roman Empire never really got over the Alps. They just couldn't. So a lot of Northern Europe was more or less protected from it because there wasn't any way in. And then military orders also, there was no way to communicate. So generals would be sent out on their own, but you just couldn't get messages back and forth in a timely way. So that would break too eventually. So they were only going to get so big. And then eventually they use up their soil. The water is all destroyed. There's no more forest to take. And the whole thing collapses. And then it springs up again somewhere else nearby. So that's really been the pattern. And this is across the world. This is everywhere. It's every continent. You have empires of corn in North America and South America. You've got the wheat beef people and potatoes, right? You've got everything that came out of the Middle East and then spread everywhere. The rice ones in Asia, and it's all the same pattern. You end up with these highly militarized, hierarchical societies based on slavery and drawdown. So the topsoil's gone. We ran out of topsoil in 1950. What we've been eating ever since is literally fossil fuel. That's what fertilizes all of that stuff. And then came the Green Revolution. So it should have reached a kind of natural endpoint then when the topsoil was just gone. But instead, they figured out how to take oil and gas and turn it into usable products for plants. And then they made the plants grow really short and really big seed heads. So that was the so-called Green Revolution. And the human population quadrupled. So we are still faced with the same inevitable collapse, only now it's going to be 4 times worse. And that's the corner, the corner we painted ourselves into now, because there's no other planet. This is it. And we've taken it all. And now we're adding, this fairy tale that somehow we can continue this destruction if we just somehow fuel it using, solar, wind, biomass, whatever they think. And none of this is actually going to pan out to be anything. So it's sort of a last gasp effort to keep this going. Well, it would be a disaster because we're looking at the last fish on the planet. The oceans are 90% empty. 80% of the rivers on the planet don't even reach the ocean anymore. Whatever it is. It's horrible, whatever it is. We know that. 98% of the old growth forests are gone. 99% of the world's old prairies are gone. We've taken it all. It's drawdown and overshoot. That's the problem. And once you get those concepts, it's drawdown and overshoot. There's no way forward with that. All you can do is back it up and try to let the world repair, which could still be done. I keep saying, I'm not out of hope. It's not too late. And honestly, we're even seeing little bits of that right now, right? We're all under this lockdown. I know this is hard. A lot of people are dying in terrible ways. There's a lot of stress. There's terrible things happening. I'm not in any way celebrating this, but we are also seeing right away the air pollution has lifted. People can see the sky for the first time. They can breathe outside, for the first time in decades in some places. There's wild animals suddenly being sighted in all kinds of crazy places because the humans aren't there. And it's all we have to do is stop destroying, and the world will come back. So there's every reason to hope, but we've got to name the problem and then talk about actual solutions to that problem. And that's where I think everybody's tripped up.
And that's what I would love to hear more. And please, Derrick, go ahead. But after, maybe we can talk about what the book's solutions are.
Oh, go ahead. She covered that well.
Yeah. So the book kind of breaks down. It talks about resistance. It talks about organization, solutions, the future. Give people a sense of what they'll read as going through the book. Maybe break down a little bit about what does resistance look like, and
Thank you. No, I did the last one. You
I could have done that.
you can start us off, Derrick.
Well, one of the things that got us in a lot of trouble writing this book, we thought we were going to get in trouble because we were suggesting decisive attacks on infrastructure. But the thing that we've gotten the most crap for is we believe in organized resistance. And I have a hard time even saying this with a straight face because it's such a stupid thing, but we've been yelled at for years about this. I can't believe that people are so opposed to organization. That if they argue that if you believe in any form of organization, then that makes you a Stalinist, which seems I'm having a hard time saying this without laughing. It's just so stupid. But there are this category of anarchist who says this to anybody who organizes, and I don't understand how anybody thinks you can take on the full power of the state without organizing. And we believe that, oh, it's like King Lear with, you take the one arrow and you break it, and you take the second arrow and you break it, you take the third arrow and you break it, and then you put a bunch of arrows together and you can't break them. And there's a great line by somebody I don't remember right now. He's very much is a proponent of the Western way of life. And he says that the West won the world not by the strength of its ideas, but by its organization, by its application of organized violence. And people in the West always forget this, and people everywhere else never do. And the point being that the United States has conquered the planet, and the West has conquered the planet. And in Endgame, I focused on the use of the word violence because I was trying to rid people of the notion that the dominant culture expands through the power of its ideas. But instead, it's like you said about the Neanderthals being conquered, that the Neanderthals in Europe were wiped out in a couple generations, and the anthropologists say that it was not because they decided to, it was because, the only thing they find is a bunch of war weapons that were conquered and eradicated. But there's another point to be made here, which is the worst use of the word organized. That one of the reasons that the West has been able to conquer the planet is because of the ability to organize into, I wasn't going to go here, but I think I have to, Mumford. That people sometimes ask me what I think the most important invention the dominant culture has ever come up with. And I don't think it's the wheel. I don't think it's the rifle. I don't think it's gunpowder. I don't think it's the cotton gin. I don't think it's what else would it be? The screw. Screws are really important. It's not the internal combustion engine. It's not any of those that people think. What it is the corporation. It's what Lewis Mumford called the mega machine, which is humans gathered together in numbers large enough to accomplish some major task in a bureaucratic top-down military style organization. which I am not saying is the best style of organization at all. And I'm not saying DGR is that style of organization at all either. What I'm saying is that is what accomplished building the pyramids. That is what has accomplished conquering the planet. That is what delivers Coca-Cola around the world. That is what delivered the Jews to the death camps. That is what delivers trees to timber mills. That is what delivers toilet paper, or did deliver toilet paper, to stores. That is what stores. This is humans are fundamentally contentious, and in groups of larger than, I mean, think about your relations with your family. You know, it's like, yeah, you argue with this person, you get along with this person, not with this person. That's all fine. But then you get to larger and larger groups, and we just argue a lot. But how did they organize tens of thousands of people in such a way that they could build something completely useless as a pyramid? I mean, didn't everybody go, God, why am I spending my life doing this? Well, because if I don't, they're going to kill me, for one thing. Anyway, so it just strikes me as unutterably naive that some people think that you can take on the full power of the mega machine, which is truly global, and do it without having any organizational schema whatsoever. That's one of the, and that was not something I was prepared for when we put out the book. We put out the book, an organization was just, here's some ways you can organize. I don't know about you, but I wasn't expecting any pushback on that. It's just, God, you want to push back, it's going to be on trying to bring down civilization. But it's like, good God, we have to first talk about the fact that maybe if you're going against the Turks for about 300 years, from, I don't know, 1600 till 1900 or 1500 till 1800, they lost basically every battle that they fought. And the reason they lost every battle they fought is because they did not believe in a larger military organization. Every unit would act independently. And so when they fought any other country, the other country would have an organized front, and they would pick them off one by one. Or Rorke's Drift is a great example. There's 100 and some British took on a couple thousand Zulus, and the Zulus were individually braver, but they attacked piecemeal. They attacked 5 of them now, 5 of them now. They attacked whenever they felt like it, got completely slaughtered. It just seems like a bad idea. I know I'm getting way off track, so why don't you say something? And I'm gonna
Okay. Well, I think what makes DGR different from other books is that we actually want to suggest solutions that match the scale of the problem. And given what we are up against, we would at least like people to consider things that have been off the table for a long time. And just to put this very bluntly, we are talking about industrial sabotage. So you've got just these gigantic industries that all rely on oil, gas, coal, and electricity. And those are actually really, really vulnerable infrastructures. And this is what guerrilla warfare is all about. And you can go to any training camp in the world and learn how to do this. The US government puts out manuals on how to train people to do it. We all know it's incredibly effective. That's why you can be trained to do it by any army in the world. And why are we not doing this in defense of the planet? It would not involve civilian casualties. It would probably involve no casualties if it was done well. But I don't see any reason why we couldn't do it. And it would mean, we're trying to do what Derrick wants to say something.
Well, part of the problem is that we need to recognize that war has been declared on the planet and has been for several thousand years. And we need, as I said before, to put our loyalty with the natural world. And we need to stop thinking like a loyal opposition. And we need to start thinking like
a serious resistance movement. So, I mean, we need decisive action on a continental scale. So there's lots of bottlenecks that are extremely vulnerable. The oil only comes into the country in a few places. We know where they are. It's not a big secret. You can read about them online. If you live there, you certainly know. Louisiana is a big one. It's called LOOP, the Louisiana Offport Oil, and that's where a lot of it comes in. And this would not be a hard thing to do. Now, people have also done this non-violently, and I have nothing against that. The problem with nonviolence is that it involves lots of people. So if you think that we've got millions of people lined up, ready to throw themselves between fossil fuel and what is left of this planet, I'm happy to go with that. The problem that I have is that I don't see the numbers, and I haven't seen the numbers ever in my lifetime. And I can't risk that, because I want it to be true, therefore it will be. I just don't see it. And that was a very grim moment for me, just coming to that, just having to accept that as a grown up, that it's not what I want it to be. So what's left? Given the numbers that we do have, what could we do? So one example that I really like is the French labor strike in 2010. So this was all about austerity measures. It wasn't about saving the planet, but they shut down the economy. And the way that they did that was they blockaded the oil terminals. They did other things too, but that was one of the main things. So it's just human chains. They just formed around the oil facilities so that they couldn't offload the oil, and then the oil couldn't go anywhere once it was there. So they stranded all these oil tankers out in the Mediterranean, and they were running out of oil. So they were shutting down the economy. They had to, because there was no more oil. And that was done completely nonviolently. Nobody lost any life. Now, at the end of the day, they lost. They all had to go back to work. But it shows that if you have people who are willing to put their bodies on the line, what could be done? If you can think strategically enough and to be organized, right? These are the points. It's not just kind of vaguely, let's take over an intersection in our downtown. No. What would actually stop the economy? We know oil, gas, coal. It's not hard. These are the the train lines. These are the ports. This is where it happens. This is where you would shut it down. And again, if we had a few million people willing to do it day after day after day, we could shut this party down by midnight. It's very clear that we could. But I don't see anybody willing to do it. That's the problem. So given that we don't have that, well, what's the next step? Well, something else to consider. We could do property destruction. We could, ramp it up to the next level. So now we get to groups like MEND, and that was the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta. So the Niger Delta is the world's largest wetland. It could now be called a sludge land. They're basically knee-deep in oil. The place is just utterly wrecked by the oil industry. And of course, they were promised all kinds of things. We'll split the profits with you, and we'll give you schools and hospitals and all this. And none of that comes true, and everybody's sick and starving. So they had a few decades of very committed nonviolent resistance, and then everybody was killed by the private army that is hired by oil industries. Yes, they have their own private armies, and they do things like that. So everybody was killed, and then the next generation of people said, all right, well, we're going to give up the nonviolence. So a few hundred people, well-armed, well-trained, well-prepared, were able to bring the oil industry in Nigeria to its knees on a number of occasions. And they did it by simply sabotaging all the infrastructure that's out there in the water. So, all of that stuff, the pipelines and the actual, mechanical pumps and all this, they just went after it. And they had little speedboats and a few hundred people. So tops, maybe 500 people total. And there were times when they completely stopped the oil industry by 80%. So like in 1 week of sustained attacks, they were able to stop 80% of the oil. That's all it takes. So what if 500 of us in America and 500 of us in Canada and 500 of us in Mexico and maybe 1,000 people in China and maybe another 1,000 in India were willing to do this, to get that kind of training and to go after the infrastructure, which is the lifeblood of industrial civilization. The death blood, right? That's it. That's all. And this could still be done without loss of life. And I have no other suggestions. If we do nothing, the planet will die. That's quite clear. So can we just talk about it? That was why we wrote the book.
And you give examples, and you talk about ethics and above ground and below ground organization and things like that as well in the book, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There was another thing I wanted to say about that, which is, how do you win? How does one win a war?
Defeat the enemy.
Okay. Well, actually, the way one wins more or less every war is not necessarily by winning on the battlefield, but instead it's by destroying the enemy's capacity to wage war. So, yes, the United States defeated the Confederacy at the Battle of Gettysburg and the Battle of Vicksburg, and those were important. But what was really important, well, the reason Vicksburg was important is because it cut off Texas from the rest of the Confederacy and cut off the supplies. And the blockade is what won. And what won World War II? Well, there was a Soviet army. But in addition to the Soviet army, the United States and Britain's main contributions to winning World War II were bombing destroying the German capacity to wage war, destroying the German industrial base, destroying the German rail transportation line, really.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that we're trying to get people, like a resistance movement. So if you were in France and occupied France and the Nazis had occupied your country and you joined the underground, one of the main things that, one of the important roles you had was blowing up bridges and blowing up rail lines. That's all. Like, take out the bridges and the rail lines for obvious reasons. So it's the same deal. Like, this is how this is all being supplied. And we know the supply lines. They're right there in front of all of us. So why aren't we thinking like, people under occupation? This is the only planet we have. We are animals who should love our homes. Why are we not defending them?
And the question I ask all the time is, if Delta smelt could take on human manifestation, what would they do? If coho salmon could take on human manifestation, what would they do? And those questions are not meant to be just rhetorical flourishes. It's really, if cod in the North Atlantic could develop opposable thumbs, what would they do vis-a-vis the commercial fishing fleets? I mean, I think the answers get pretty clear. What would, if fajitas, we'll take one that's really easy because they're poachers. If fajitas could take on human manifestation, how long would the poachers last in the Gulf of California? They wouldn't last overnight. And the point is that we have been trained for thousands of years now to care more about the continuation of this way of life than we have life on the planet. And this is true for any abusive system, that one of the things we identify with the abuser, and we're taught to, and that's beyond the scope of this interview, but we need to make our loyalty back to life on the planet, to the real source of life.
I think one example you both brought up from time to time is Ireland. And, I think I'm doing a little research on that. I think only 3,000 people at any given time were in the NRA during the 1920 era. And they didn't defeat the British Army head to head. They just took out their ability to wage war in Ireland, right?
Yeah. I mean, we're never going to go up against something like the United States Army and win. It's a ridiculous proposition. But there are things we can do. Very clearly, there are things we can do.
And is that like a pretty close model to, because I think you talk about above ground organizations and below ground, and maybe we can go into this further at another time, but in breaking down the book further. But I did find that there was a lot of information in the book about those kind of organizational strategies.
So most people are never going to join an underground group, and that's fine. They either can't take the risks or they just don't have the personality for it. And that's utterly okay, because 98% of even a standing army, 98% of the people in that army do the support. So they're doing things like logistics, and that has to happen. So the 2% are going to do their thing, but everybody else is going to be involved in the kinds of above ground things that also need to happen. And those are really important jobs. It's not like I would never say that somebody, should try to do something that they're not capable of doing. We all have to do what we can do. And there's tons of stuff to be done above ground, like everything from developing completely new food systems to, direct democracy. We all need to get used to doing that because we don't do it and we don't know how to do it, but we're going to have to do it. We're going to have to learn to make decisions as a community that are going to work more or less for everybody. So all of that kind of work has and systems of justice, like how do you solve disputes? What do you do with abusers in the community? Like all of those things have to be worked out in some way. And that's an incredible amount of work for somebody. And all of that's really important. But as the old system comes down, you have to be ready with the new institutions, or the whole thing just is going to get taken over by, little mini warlord fascists. Like, that's what happens when states collapse. And I don't want us to be in that situation. So we tried really hard to address all of this in the book, but who knows?
Excellent.
Derrick has to go.
Yes.
So, but we could do round 2 another day if you want to get into more of that.
Yes, I think this was a great overview. I appreciate both of you being here today. I think if you're willing to, I'd love to have you back and talk about the different sections of the book a little bit more. Give people more of an idea of what they what they're going to be reading. Get your commentary on it. I know there's a lot to digest in that book. So, is there anything else that you wanted to add before we go?
One thing I do want to say is that none of this is easy. It's not morally easy, and it shouldn't be. I mean, we're talking about things that are really serious, and this isn't something that you sort of try on for a day or, can think about in a humorous fashion. It's not. It's really serious stuff. And I just want to make sure that gets conveyed, that I wouldn't suggest anybody think about this unless they're ready to be seriously engaged and challenged. And a lot of it is just morally heartbreaking because we're in a position that nobody has ever been in before. It's every last living creature is now under assault. So I don't feel like there's much choice but to think this through, sort of from beginning to end. And people may come to different decisions about it, and I totally respect that. But these are the only solutions that I can find that even begin to match the scale of the problem. And I can't back away from my moral responsibility because of my moral horror. But it's not an easy, we're not asking people to do something that's simple or easy, because it's not. And honestly, it shouldn't be, because it's pretty serious.
Well, she says that, and I agree with it. But at the same time, I don't want to scare people away from DGR because it's actually quite a fun community and a bunch of really good people. And because we make this distinction between above ground and below ground work, and there has to be a firewall between them, and we are all doing advocacy work, and there are plenty of people in DGR who basically, being in DGR just means you recognize that the culture is itself unsustainable. But that doesn't mean that, there are people in DGR who are working to stop prairie dog village destruction. There are those who are just working to stop the destruction of juniper forests in Nevada. So there's lots of people just doing their own individual work as part of, or their own collective work as part of this larger collective that recognizes. So DGR in that sense is sort of an umbrella organization that just, yeah, we're saving prairie dogs right here and right now, but we also recognize that the culture is inherently destructive. So I don't want you to scare people away with that, because it's not, being in DGR itself is not that scary.
Because DGR is an above ground organization, right?
We're totally above ground. And I don't think I've ever quite appreciated the First Amendment in the way that I have since being an author of that book, because we had to have 3 lawyers look it over and we had to take some stuff out. But the rest of it is protected speech. So we live in a country where we can at least discuss these as ideas. And that's actually pretty incredible. So, yay First Amendment. And you're allowed to read books. So don't be put off just because I might have said something a little bit scary. I just mean that they are serious moral issues. And I really want people to engage with that on a kind of a deep level, because it's not a surface level problem.
Well, thank you again. And if there's anything else you wanted to add, Derrick, feel free. But
no, it's great. Thank you so much. Thank you for your great questions.
You bet. Hopefully we'll see you guys again soon, and we'll have links in the future to the next discussions. So thanks again.
Okay, thanks.